All right, here we are. Technical challenges resolved, hopefully. Yay! Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Adriana Popescu. It's been a while since I've been live, so I'm very excited to have with me today my good friend and colleague, TJ Woodward. What can I say about TJ? He's brilliant. He is a thought leader, a speaker, an author, a lovely human being. He's just one of my favorite people to have these conversations with. Welcome, TJ.
Thank you, Adriana. And you are one of my favorite people to have conversations with as well. So here we go. I'm so happy to be with you.
Yes. So I wanted to do May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And every year I try to put some information out there that I think might be of interest and relevant to the audience and to, the public in general, because I think we still, unfortunately, even though mental health is far more like prominent and something we're talking about and looking at, which is wonderful because it certainly wasn't when we were kids. I still feel like there's a lot of misconceptions. I still feel that there's a lot of information that people are lacking. And today's theme, like what I chose to highlight for Mental Health Awareness Month, is the topic of spirituality and why is it important for people's mental health? Is it even? Because some people are still, I think, really confused. So I want us to talk about those things today. What is spirituality? Why is it important to your mental health? How do you use it to create, a life of infinite possibilities? All the fun things we love to talk about. So I will start by asking you the question. So when people ask you, what is spirituality? What do you say?
I usually answer the question with a question. I'm sure you're not surprised, but I really want to invite people to define it for themselves. And I think one of the common conversations that comes up when we ask the question, what is spirituality, is a lot of people have spirituality and religion interlinked. And for some people it is, but for other people, it's something totally different. So I will out of the gate say the most important thing is that a person defines it for themselves. But for me, I always want to look at what religion I grew up in. Did I grow up in a religion? In any way, does that relate to spirituality, or might it be different? And if it is, what would your definition be? For me, it really comes down to the experience of wholeness. When I came into the world, I remember being very filled with joy and happiness early in life. And then I remember that experience of connection and openness subsiding over time. And when I think about what people are looking for in recovery or therapy or a spiritual practice, it's pretty much what a 2-year-old does automatically. I want to learn to feel my feelings. I want to learn to be more present. I want to learn to be more loving and more open. So to me, that's inherently spiritual. The spirit that we are, which is really different than a belief system, because a belief system is thought, and spirituality to me is really more of an experience.
Right. A being, a knowing. It's almost like it's deeper than thinking or feeling alone. Like the Buddhists might say that that's more the realm of the ego or the lowercase s self. And what you're talking about with spirit is more like the capital S self. That is about connection to that divine spark within, if we want to call it something like that. And it's also the connection with all that is, right? Like I tend to think of spirituality from this oneness paradigm as well, right? Like we're all connected and there is no real separation between us energetically, only what we think is separate or what we imagine to be separate. Like when you get into some of the like quantum physics stuff, right? And you get down into like quantum entanglement and things, like the convergence of science and spirituality, right? It's so fascinating that the deeper you go into the science, the more you realize there is no real separation, and we can really trip out on that whole concept. So to me, yes, connection is very much a part of it as well. Not only a connection to that divine thing within me, but also all that is divine in the world. And that's a hard concept for people to wrap their minds around, I think.
That's right. Well, we come into the world absolutely open and present. So like a very young person is still much more connected with that experience of oneness, right? I think I love what you're saying about science and spirituality, this convergence of it, because I think we're living in exciting times in that way, because to me, true spirituality is living in the question, and true science is living in the question.
Right.
And my guess is people in about 100 years are going to look back on conversations like this and say something like, they were starting to get it. Like they were talking about oneness, but we were still talking about the world through the lens of separation. And to me, that's what gets taught, whether we call that the ego or the personality or the defense strategies, whatever we call it, we get trained to believe that we're separate, us and them, good and bad, right and wrong.
Right.
And true spirituality is a recognition that there's one field and we're all part of that one field. That's an exciting conversation. And even those of us who have been in this for a while might still have thoughts of separation. I see the person as an other. I mean, a great spiritual teacher was asked, how do we make peace with others? And the answer was, there are no others.
Well, let's go there, because I think that was going to be part of our conversation. Like, in this time that we're living in, I don't think we've, in my lifetime, certainly that I've been here, this go around, like, I don't remember a time when we were quite so polarized as we are right now in the world, where there is so much separation. There is so much us versus them. There's a ton of hatred. There's a ton of judgment. Like, you're wrong, who you are and how you live and where you're from and the color of your skin and who do you go to bed with and all the things, all that's wrong and we're right, right? Yeah. Especially here in the US, we've got a lot of that going on. It feels more separate than ever.
It's interesting. I will say two things about that. One, I read an interesting article that said we receive more information in one day than people 100 years ago received in 1 year. Wow. So we have these little devices in our pocket and we're constantly seeing things that are happening in the world. Well, even if they're not really happening now with AI, that's a whole other conversation, right? But we see it, we're digesting a lot of material. But I also want to lean into, and it's a little bit provocative to say it, but I love provocative. I don't think we're living in polarized times. I think we've been conditioned to have polarized thinking. We've been told we live in a polarized country. And although there's plenty of evidence to see that, it really is about the conditioning that we've been brought up around. We get taught, like I said, and like you said, to see the world through the other. And if we go back, it makes sense, because when we lived in caves, if we walked out of our cave, we might be eaten. So we had to find people to protect us. That's where tribalism came from, right? To literally keep us alive. And there is something about that creates safety. As we evolve, it's time for us to look at, is this the greatest degree of safety, or is there something more happening? So we see the world through this us and them lens. And when we're in our points of view and our opinions, of course, we're going to find things to disagree on. Adriana, you and I agree on a lot of things, but if we spent enough time, we could find disagreement. So it's not really necessarily about that to me. It's how do I actually heal the lens rather than heal what's happening in the world?
Well, so how would one do that?
Question everything.
Yeah.
Right? Question every idea I've ever had. You and I love the conversation of living in the question, but it also comes down to, we came into the world as this whole, complete, and perfect being. That's not what some people are taught. I just did a training last week in a different state, and there was a broad spectrum of different experiences. And when I introduced the idea that we came into the world as a whole and perfect being, there were a couple of people who said, I was taught through my church that we are born broken. And that we'll never be perfect. There's only one perfect person, and we need to surrender to that. And that's how they were framing it. Right. And so that's a very different framework than what we're talking about.
Yeah. So let's look at that for a moment, because you're really referencing now some of the dogma of organized religion. And I think this is where people can often get tripped up. I see one of two things, and I'd like to hear, your thoughts on this. I see people who've grown up with some sort of organized religious experience, or even something more fringe, like some more cultish perhaps, but they grow up in a system where there's a very specific set of beliefs. There are specific practices and rituals, and people may have experienced some traumatic stuff around that. They may have felt very judged or invalidated because they didn't fit the paradigm, or they were told from a very young age, yes, you were born in sin, or you're a terrible person. There's a lot of judgment. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of fear. And I think if people, and of course there could have been trauma with like sexual abuse or physical,
Yeah.
abuse of some sort that was done in the name of the religion, or, God is punishing you for whatever. Um, so I think people have had these traumatic experiences potentially with religion, which then sort of sours them on anything remotely going in that direction, including spirituality. And then you also have the people who grew up with no kind of religion or spirituality. I see both really struggling with that, that you're telling me that the spiritual is something I need to look at, which we'll get into why we think that. But like, how do people who have experienced trauma or no spiritual or religious sort of training or experience earlier in life, like, how do you deal with that when those folks show up, in your practice or workshops or whatever it is?
Yeah, well, I think that's why let's talk about the group of folks who've had some form of religious trauma. It's something that is really layered in terms of unpacking it, and that's why I always start with what is religion to you and what is spirituality to you. Are they the same? Are they different? So not about me defining it, even though I'm always happy to. It's really, what does it mean to you? And inevitably, when we talk about spirituality, there's a group in the conscious recovery method where we look at the 4 rooms: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And when we brainstorm spiritual, almost inevitably people say belief. A
Mhm.
belief is a thought. So we will often say, what are your spiritual beliefs? And that's where we can get hung up, because then it's easy to be, well, I believe something different. And, we look at world religions that say we're the only ones that go to heaven. And I remember being a kid thinking, so only 20% of the world's going to heaven? Like, what kind? I don't get that. Right. So when we're in thought, which lives in the intellectual room to me, not the spiritual room, then we're automatically in, that us and them paradigm. The way we heal it, to me, is to start with separating those two and looking at what those two might mean. Because we'll hear people say, like, I had so much trauma around religion, I don't want to hear anything that sounds like it. Maybe it's not even conscious. They're just reacting to it. Like you said, they're just kind of pushing away. Understandable. I always look at people through the lens of compassion with that. I understand how that could happen. It really was not my experience. I, strangely enough, had a beautiful religious experience growing up. But to me, even with that quote unquote beautiful experience, which it really was, I still wanted to separate religion, which to me, the essence of religion is trying to put a framework around spirituality. But as you said, that can become dogmatic, because then it's like, here's what we believe. If you believe like we do, come join us. Or you're born into that, and you're just indoctrinated from a very early age, these different ideas and beliefs. So to me, we start by separating it and then ask a person, if you are interested in spirituality, what would that look like in terms of your mental health or your recovery?
And then how about those folks who haven't had any exposure, and then they're really like confused about, I don't understand, we keep talking, because you and I both work, in addiction and recovery, right? And this is often emphasized in treatment, in rehab, right? We talk about, well, a big part of recovery is developing some sort of meaning, purpose, spirituality. And people are like, I don't know what that is. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have that growing up.
Yeah, a lot of people get taught that logic is the supreme power, right? So we're really in our mind. And the funny thing to me, and it really is funny to me, having worked in treatment for many years, when someone came with a very logical or cerebral approach, I always appreciated that, because then we could kind of talk it through. And maybe they would say something like, oh, I don't believe in all this spiritual stuff. I believe only in science or a scientific approach. Well, what is science? As I already said, it's living in the question. It's looking at the possibilities. To me, that's the essence of spirituality. Where we get off of that, or where we can divert from that, is when we believe science has answers instead of science asks questions. And
Mhm.
that's the same with spirituality, when we believe that spirituality has answers instead of asking questions. So to me, the essence of the two of them are really living in the hypothesis. What if? What if it's this? What if it's that? What gets created when I do this? So in that way, I actually find that someone who doesn't have any of that, maybe we call it baggage around religion, also might not be interested in it. But again, if we separate it and ask someone what spirituality might mean to them, And if that word doesn't work, what if there's a place within us that is unharmed and unharmable? What if there's an essential place within us? Then we can start to work with that.
So let's bring in the topic of mental health, which I think also includes, addiction and recovery and a broad spectrum of things. What is the connection between spirituality and mental health? Why are we talking about this in the spirit of Mental Health Awareness Month?
Well, it's even interesting to me that we call that mental health, because
Right.
mental health is by its very nature defined as my brain is healthy or my thoughts are healthy, right?
Right.
The intellectual room, but really, as we've already said, physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And we really spend time in all of those rooms, and the rooms affect one another. That's what's important to me. So if I believe that the only way I quote unquote heal a mental health concern or issue is through the mind, it can be really limiting, because the mind is set up through its programming. Spirituality allows us to move beyond the mind and start to expand the mind's awareness. In other words, going back to, if it's only the mind, it might be like, I'm looking for the answer. Where if we come into the spiritual room, we might be, I'm asking the question. Nothing changes if nothing changes. To go a little deeper with that, I think a lot of the way we quote unquote treat mental health is through the intellect. So we have a lot of modalities that say, okay, you have this trauma, and this trauma has created this relationship you have with your thoughts and your brain. Change the thoughts, opposite action. All of that can be useful, but here's what's important to me. When we were really young, we were more in touch with our spiritual room, and our brains weren't even developed. And so maybe we've absorbed trauma at an early age, or we've made these huge decisions. I got dragged on social media. I know that's shocking, but I was in a video. Actually, it was a video I did with Gabor Mate, which I thought it was a great video on trauma. And I talked about not being able to tie my shoes in kindergarten, which I talk about a lot. And this person said, are you kidding me? He's saying he's an addict because he couldn't tie his shoes in kindergarten. Is this an SNL skit? And I had to think about that for a moment. No, I was not saying the reason I'm a quote unquote addict, which I don't even own that label to start with, but it's not because I couldn't tie my shoes. What I was pointing to is we have these huge experiences when our brains aren't even developed. If anything, the person's pointing to my point with this, which is, how could something that seems so small be so significant? Well, I didn't have a developed brain. So I literally absorbed the idea that I was unworthy and I was not smart enough. And that became the operating system for my life. And so we don't heal that cognitively because it really didn't happen when my brain was developed.
Mm-hmm. Well, also what I often say to people is something one of my mentors, had often said, which was like, look, if your mind could have figured it out already and solved the problem, it would have done so. You wouldn't be here like in this workshop or therapy session or whatever it is, trying to figure it out. Like, it's not figure out. I think so much of spirituality is not figure outable.
Figure outable. I love it. That's my new hashtag.
Right? It's like, it's not something you can, and this is why it's sometimes even hard to talk about, because words tend to be primarily intellectual, and spiritual experiences are not defined by words. I want to talk about that for a moment. Like this idea of the mystical experience or a spiritually transformative experience, because it is going to show up. I'll bring it back to mental health or psychological well-being, because a lot of things that I think, people, when they're having spiritual experiences, it can go sideways for them and it can get misdiagnosed as some sort of pathological psychological condition. I'll explain more about that. But let's just talk for a moment about spiritual experiences. Can you elaborate on what is that? What is a spiritual experience that may go beyond the definition of words? And I'm asking you to talk about it, but
Oh yeah, no, I love it, because to me, this is the essence of the spiritual experience, is moving beyond thought. It's not getting rid of thought. I mean, I spent a decade trying to quiet my mind or change my narrative. And maybe I spent 20 years trying to change the narrative, but at 10 years for sure, I thought meditation was quieting the mind. And I was like, shut up mind, shut up mind, shut up mind. And it was like getting louder and louder and louder. I can't meditate, right? When I heard someone say a spiritual experience or meditation, the purpose is to observe the mind, then I became really had a very different relationship with my mind, and I started to separate. And then the question was asked, well, if you're not the thought and you're observing the thought, who or what is observing? And I was like, right, let me be with that for the next decade, right? Who or what is the observer? This is why psychedelic medication is so popular right now. And I think it does have a place in mental health recovery and addiction recovery. I know it can be controversial for some people, and I know this is way overly simplified. So I want to be really clear. I know it's way more nuanced than this, but one of the things it does is it kind of shuts down the mind so that we can go into the experience. And that doesn't necessarily need to be achieved through a medication. It can also be achieved through meditation. It can be achieved through the practice of unlearning, the practice of questioning my thoughts. But when we have that moment where the mind is not in charge, it doesn't mean we get rid of the mind, but when spirit, and I say it this way, because somehow it works for me, physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. When the spiritual room is the CEO, in other words, when that's the predominant room, then the mind can become a useful tool. But when I believe I am my thoughts, I'm in the separation, I'm in the, this is never going to change. Why do I keep doing this? So to me, the spiritual experience is just remembering who we really are. That's beyond thought.
That's a beautiful way to say it. I think if I were asked, like, what is a spiritual experience? It's like, again, it can be hard to talk about in words, but we do have some sort of categories that people have studied, and that people, we can say some people have had similar experiences. Let's say in a near death experience, right?
Yeah.
Many people will call that a spiritual experience. There are some common threads. Sometimes people see a light, or they see their life flash before their eyes, or they reconnect with loved ones who have passed, or they feel the presence of divine beings like angels or God or spirit guides or whatever your language is, for that. They often report feeling a sense of like their heart opening and like love, profound, deep, unconditional love. That might be an experience that we might call spiritual, or being in nature and feeling like, I've always said, like when I lay in the ocean, and and the sun is beaming down on me, and I'm feel like I'm one with the water and the earth and the sun. And it's like, there is no separation. Like, to me, that is a spiritual experience.
Well, and that's really what you're pointing to, I think, is the power of it. And you've said it a few times, and that is experiencing oneness. And to me, the way I frame it is I actually touch reality and I begin to question the illusion, and the illusion is the separation, or I begin to have an experience of oneness and the sense of separation is lost. I had a profound experience in Varanasi, India, where it felt like my ego was stripped away and there was an energetic experience of oneness where I literally didn't see the people around me as separate, but part of one organism, if you will. Yeah. And that experience lasted for quite some time. And then my ego, my quote unquote ego came back, but I didn't realize until a decade later that what had happened was I had had a permanent shift in my relationship to the ego. And if the ego, that can be a complex concept, it's just my thoughts, my personality, my points of view. When that became something I had rather than who I am, and I remembered the felt sense of oneness, that did create a permanent shift in how I viewed what I call reality.
Yeah. Now, many people will describe spirit and spiritual experiences too. I think they can happen in churches, or they can happen in ceremonies of various sorts, like sound healing. I've definitely had profound spiritual kind of openings and heart openings and different things with sound healing, or dance movement, right? Like, I mean, their creativity, art, music, like there's so many different ways in which being underwater, scuba diving, that actually many people have described, or the experience of free diving. Many people have described that as a spiritual experience. I referenced this in a newsletter I sent out the other day. Edgar Mitchell, who was one of the first astronauts on the moon, when he came back from the moon and he looked at the earth. He had this like
Mm.
profound spiritual awakening kind of experience, and it prompted him to start IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences,
Oh, wow.
because he
Yeah.
wanted to study those types of experiences through the question and through a more scientific lens. So sometimes these spiritual experiences can be beautiful and life changing and like change your neural pathways in your body and the way your energy functions in your body. I mean, it can be truly profound. It could come from psychedelics too. Many people had that back in the 60s, in the early days of experimenting with all that. But sometimes the spiritual experience can be frightening, can seem negative, can seem traumatizing, like a bad trip, or as something, we call it, Stan Groff coined the term spiritual emergency, that as you're
Right.
having an experience, it can feel terrifying. It can feel the veil can drop, and the ego, you can have that sense of like the ego dissolving, but that can be terrifying instead of freeing or something like that. Can you speak to that experience? What happens when it seems like scary? Because this is where the mental health, I think, is going to come back in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different directions to go in that conversation. One is when we have this awareness that we're much greater than this body or these thoughts or even our emotions, so that we're actually part of this vast neural network, if you will, or this vast network of spirit. That can be really scary for people, for sure, because we touch reality and everything we've ever been taught gets questioned. It's like, oh my gosh, there's no stability under my feet. That's why I'll say to someone, if you're feeling disillusioned, congratulations. That means you're moving away from the illusion. It's right there in the word. I feel so disillusioned. We use that as a negative, but like I always like, great. That means the illusion of how you've created your life, or this thing that we call reality. We turn on the news. Why is the news all the horrific things happening in the world? Why did we decide that's the news? That's not news. It's old. It's the same old story. And that I get that from my friend Michael Beckwith. He says news is not news. It's old. And I love that.
Same old, same old. Yeah, I like that.
99.999% of things happening on the planet are beautiful and loving. And there's these things that do happen, and we focus on that. So we're programmed in that way. The other piece I want to speak to, and you mentioned this earlier too, is the dark night of the soul. When I was going through, and Adriana, you were there for my dark night of the soul. It was intense. I had this series of spiritual awakenings, and I had this divine idea for my life that was much greater than the way I had created it. And because I said yes to that, all that was not in alignment with that needed to disintegrate.
Yes.
That can look and feel really painful. And in my case, I lost my house, I lost my job, I lost my partner, I lost my car, I went bankrupt. I mean, it was dark. I had a legal situation. It was messy. I'm not saying everyone needs to have it be that messy, but for me, for whatever reason, that disengagement from ego reality needed to crumble and fall away. And ultimately, I had to move toward that. When you plant a seed, you don't put it out in the sunshine, because if you just put the seed out in the sunshine, it burns. You have to put it in the fertile soil. The metaphor is simple. You put it in that place of darkness, and you allow that darkness move into that darkness and tend to that seed. And eventually it does go to the light, but it can't start there, right? And I like that metaphor because I wanted to do the bypass. Everything's great. Everything is love. Everything is light. Well, there was stuff that I had created through my ego that needed to dissolve. And at first it was painful, but then it was liberating.
So I love that you brought up the dark night of the soul and what I would call shadow work, because I agree with you. I think that those are two key elements to spiritual growth and evolution and raising consciousness and ascension. That's a big term we're hearing right now, is ascension. For me, and I can relate with it, for me, it's always tended to show up physically.
Yeah.
I had a 20-year battle with Lyme disease, which was to me very much a dark night of the soul. I was like, especially in the early days when I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't have a proper diagnosis. All I knew is I was feeling horrible. I was super depressed. My life was falling apart, and I had no idea. I felt like no sense of control over that, and like couldn't even control what was happening with my body. And that was, it was right around the time I started grad school, and I started learning about living in the question and learning about other kinds of healing modalities and learning about different philosophies. That's when I was really studying like Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and all these things. And it was starting to challenge my paradigm
Mhm.
of what I had known to be true. And then another piece of that shadow work for me was the trauma work. I
Yeah.
had to go into my early life experiences, the intergenerational. I have a tremendous amount of intergenerational trauma that came through my family and my parents' experiences and their parents' experiences. And then I started opening up to other lifetimes and all the
Mhm.
traumas and things that we've been through in other lifetimes. And even still I'm working through a lot of that stuff, of what, because we carry the energy of that with us. And I think that um, I've had to really face all of that shadow material and question the beliefs that came from it, question the ways in which I gave my power away to others, ways in which I maybe became a victim, that victim consciousness. You talk a lot about that, which is a very disempowered stance. Healing from all of that, like soul retrieval, like, getting the parts and pieces of myself that I left in different negative experiences, like having to do all this shadow work and this healing work and questioning the beliefs about who I am and why I'm here and the things that happen in my world. Like right now, even I'm dealing with a broken foot. I got a broken foot the night before I went to a spiritual retreat in Mount Shasta, and isn't that interesting that, like, this, and some people have spoken to me as if, what if that was a test? What if that was an initiation? Like, will you allow that to stop you from going to the mountain, having the experience that I ended up having there, which was a spiritual experience? Every time I go to Mount Shasta, it's some crazy mystical kind of
Yeah.
experience. Um, so I mean, I'm sort of rambling here, but like I think it's really important for people to understand the bypass thing. Maybe I'd like you to speak a little bit more about that. That one, we can't get around doing the shadow work, and two, if we try to do spiritual bypass, or people have this idea that I'm not doing spirituality right if it's not all love and oneness and sunshine and roses and ecstasy and joy and bliss. Yes, it can be all those things, but I said this to the shamans who I did ayahuasca for the first time in Brazil this last fall. And I said, yeah, I think all those things are possible, these beautiful, expansive experiences that people have with this medicine. But that wasn't my experience with it. I was like with the, ugh. And like, I have to release all this yuck that's like in my universe, this ego and all this other yucky stuff that I'm carrying around as my shadow. How can I be light when I'm carrying so much dark in me still?
That's right. And part of the shadow work, as you're saying, is I am accountable. Not in a way, and it's very important. And I think this is where it can be somewhat nuanced. Shame does not heal shame,
No.
and blame and shame are counterparts, right? So if I'm blaming myself or blaming someone else, I'm coming from shame. Nothing wrong with that. We're not going to go into the wrongness of it, but what does it create? It creates stuckness, right? I think about shame as like swimming in oatmeal. Like I'm trying so hard, but there's nothing that I can do to get through this. When we have, whether we call it the shadow work or the dark night of the soul, part of it is leaning in and not only healing what happened to me, and this is really important, but also healing the harm that I've caused. When you think about past lives, or as my friend Michael says, past chapters, I love that. The past chapters of when we've been here, or who knows where, maybe we've caused a lot of harm. I've caused a lot of harm in this life. And in some ways, the things that happened, quote unquote, to me, although they were difficult to heal, it was even more difficult for me to heal the stuff that I perceived I did that was wrong. And I discovered something really very simple and yet very powerful. When I understood and when I understand that I'm a whole, perfect, and infinite being, I'm not causing harm in the world. It's when I believe I'm broken that I cause harm in the world.
Yeah.
So yes, there are things I need to clean up. I've had plenty of those, but the cleaning up externally doesn't do that deeper work. And the deeper work is my own shame healing and dark night of the soul healing. You said so many things that are so powerful. And I think when we lean in and do that deeper work, ultimately maybe perhaps the greatest definition of spirituality is having love and compassion for self and others.
Yeah.
That like I came into the world as an infinite being. I started being taught and therefore believed I was broken. Of course I acted broken, right? So that shadow work is coming to peace with that, making amends where necessary. But the deeper work is a deep sense of compassion for where these wounds originated and how I can heal them from that point of origin.
And I think that piece can get overlooked, even for those of us. I notice myself, right? And this is the bias that I bring, especially being a trauma specialist, is that sometimes I think I can get overly focused on like the never ending process of clearing. I have
Yeah.
to keep clearing. Oh, there's more lifetimes of trauma. Now there's more things I have to take accountability for, like staying very focused in like what's broken, or what has created the pain and suffering. And what was pointed out to be me by one of my spiritual teachers, I'll call her, very recently, was, okay, you're doing so much of this like cleanup work, but you're sort of like at the expense of not like connecting with that wholeness within, and like moving like the healing from the inside out, but with the light. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Not just on the focus of removing the dark. Sometimes we talk about, even in conscious recovery, the work that we've collaborated on, where it's like, well, if you remove the shadow stuff, then the light will naturally shine. But maybe that seed that has been planted also needs to be tended to. It needs to be given some fertilizer. It needs to be given some water. It needs some attention. We need to grow the self-compassion. We need to grow in acts of kindness, or we need to practice non-judgment, non-resistance, spiritual principles that you've talked about, forgiveness, gratitude. Can you talk about that as a pathway with spiritual healing?
Absolutely. And I love it because I think the shadow work is so important, but so is the light work. And what does that mean, right? It means to me that it's a twofold process. It's spending dedicated time cultivating a relationship with that essential self. And that's just language that sounds separate. It's really just remembering who I am. That is probably more accurate. I call it the great remembering, because we came in with that. We look at an infant and, maybe they bring things from past chapters or past lives. I don't know, probably. But the essence of a person is whole and complete. You talked about the spiritual bypass. A lot of the work is that I've seen people do is like, let's pretend like the shadow's not there and just jump to the love and light. So it is a twofold process. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. So much focus is on what's broken, what's wrong, what's bad. How do we heal? How do we heal? How do we heal? And it's also, how do I remember who and what I am and radiate that into the world? The law of radiance is so much more powerful than the law of attraction. So it's a nuanced conversation. And to me, it's this twofold path of remembering who I am, spending dedicated time in the silence, perhaps feeling that energy field that I am. And as we've talked about already, pretty much questioning and unlearning everything that I've been taught and everything I believe that's counter to that knowing. It's both and, not either or. So thank you for bringing that.
Yeah. Well, and you just said something I want to know more about. The law of radiance is more powerful than the law of attraction. What do you mean by that?
Yes. So I think most everyone watching now has heard about the law of attraction. The law of attraction basically says, change your frequency and the world will respond. Change your vibration and you'll manifest the things that you want. Here's the catch. I think that the ego can get involved and say, once I get the shiny new object, then I'll be happy. And I spent a lot of time in that law of attraction energy. And what happened for me, and I will say for me, is, Adriana, I did a vision board, I think it was 2001 or 2. And I put all the stuff on there and I manifested all the stuff and it didn't change anything. Right. Because I knew what to put on the vision board, the house. I had a house on the hill overlooking San Francisco. That's a feat in San Francisco to get that. I had the 2-bedroom house. I had what I thought was going to make me happy. And it didn't change anything.
Yeah.
And so the law of radiance is understanding deeply who and what I am and radiating that into the world. So rather than seeking love, I want to be love. Rather than thinking I'm going to manifest all this stuff so I can be happy, I can understand that on a spiritual level, I'm already whole and complete. And then it's paradoxical. When I radiate that, the world does seem to respond. But the truth is, I'm making different choices.
Mm. Well, I mean, and just getting the energy of that, right? That's very palpable. Like if I'm radiating like my unique vibration, my essential self, my authentic self, which isn't all like, it doesn't have to even be all sunshine and roses per se, but when I'm living in that, in, when I'm being congruent with that, like that, what is that putting out in the world? Like, what is the vibration that that is bringing? We see like how much when you talk about authenticity, when we talk about it in conscious recovery, how powerful that is, right? If you knew me, when people, do that exercise, and there's a heart opening when we allow others to see us in our vulnerability. That
Yeah.
that in and of itself is a spiritual experience, right? Can I be vulnerable enough to allow people to see me authentically? And that might include the good, bad, and the ugly. It might include my shadow. But my shadow is not the who and what all of who I am.
Yeah, and I'm visual, so I think I look at like these rings, right? Like imagine like a bullseye, right, with several different rings, and the core, the essence, has always been unharmed and unharmable. That's the truth of who I am. That's that radiance. But then there's all these layers of life experience, these layers of what I believe about myself, these layers of traumatic events, these layers of things that I've done that I can't forgive myself for, the layers of relationships. There's all these things on top of it. And the best way, in my experience, to get to that core is to actually reveal the other rings. I mean, it seems so paradoxical, right? And that's why I think when people say things like perfectly imperfect, I'm not a fan of that, because I don't want to be imperfect. I want to realize that at my core, I have perfection. That doesn't mean everything I've ever done and everything I will ever do is perfect in the outer realm. So we have these rings, and the more we let someone see, that's why one of the ways we heal trauma is by revealing it. It doesn't mean we have to go back and re-experience it, but the more I allow myself to be seen in all my different layers, the more that essence of my being becomes stronger and stronger. That's when we're moving into the law of radiance. I can be that in the world. And of course, that's infectious. Of course, I match vibrations with people. But I think the deeper thing is there's really nothing to attract in the end. It's really about the choices that I'm making. And, one of the core false beliefs I had was I'm unlovable. So no amount of work on my relationships was going to change that, because if someone came along to love me, I would literally repel them unconsciously. On the surface, I was, please love me, please love me, please love me. But I would choose the person in the room to confirm the core false belief. That deeper work, that deeper healing creates a different frequency, and therefore different choices that I'm making. Suddenly it's like, no, I actually want to choose relationships that are fulfilling instead of devastating. That was my thing. Like, let me choose relationships that are so painful.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of brings us to, the title of this talk, which, what is spirituality and how do you use it to create your greatest self? I mean, I think the law of radiance and what we're talking about, like radiating from that space, is really how you would create your greatest self, because that's what would then sort of shine through and go past those layers of gunk,
Yeah.
right? And allow you to create whatever it is that you would like to create for yourself. Forget about like other people, because we can't change anybody else. But like when I think of like creating a life of infinite possibilities, I'm looking at what can I be, what can I create, and where am I standing in my own way?
That's right. And that, brings us, to the conversation of my third book, Conscious Creation, because so much of the way we talk about creation is mind-based. Let me create goals. Let me create intentions. Let me have consistent action. And although that is really important, the first few steps are really, what do I need to address and live beyond? What do I need to release so that I can remember who I am and listen very intently to inner wisdom? Because inner wisdom will radiate in a very different way. And then I can create a life of infinite possibilities. That's a really nice thing to say, but let's really lean into that. What if there are infinite possibilities, but through my programming, I can only see one? So for me, the conscious creation process starts with making peace with the past and overcoming some of these core false beliefs so that I can listen to my inner wisdom, make choices from that, and then radiate that into the world. And then, as you said, wow, it's like doors are opening where there were once cement walls, or like 3 layers of cinder block walls, right? Where I couldn't, and I was trying to crush them, or I was trying to go above and like pole vault. Once I did some of the deeper work, like we've already talked about, the shadow work, the realizing who I am, the questioning every point of view, I started to get messages from someplace much deeper. And those visions were always bigger than what I could have created in my mind. And when they come from that place, I always have everything I need to accomplish them.
And then the last piece, thank you for that. The last piece kind of in this that I wanted to make sure we hit on was the conversation of being versus doing. Because it sounds like a lot of what we're talking about, I can sense people who are listening or watching this, some of their brains are frying because, we've covered a lot of territory here. And that sometimes it can, I think especially if you're in the early stages of starting out on a journey like this, like you're someone like new to recovery, for example, maybe it feels overwhelming. Maybe it feels like, oh my God, there's so much I have to do, right? There's so much work. I have to do the shadow work. I have to heal trauma. I have to question my core false beliefs. I have to learn how to love myself and have compassion for myself. And I hear this from clients, right? Like it feels overwhelming. Where am I even supposed to start with all of that? And it sounds like a lot of doing, but I want to emphasize that, yes, while there's work maybe involved in it, it's not just do. That's part of what we got in, how we got into this mess, is the do mess, is like too much doing. So
do creates do.
Right. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think the title of your book is so informative here. What if I'm not as effed up as I think I am, right? I think a lot of this idea that I need to do comes from this idea that I'm broken and I need to fix myself. So if I believe I'm broken, yes, there's a lot of daunting work that I have to do. All the things you just mentioned. And yes, that would feel really overwhelming. That's why in conscious recovery, I try to gently introduce this idea that underneath all of our behavior is an essential self that is whole and perfect. If that's the starting point, then the actual work feels much less like work. And we shift from, as the cliche goes, a human doing to a human being. Let me be that. And that's part of conscious creation too. The last step in conscious creation is embodying the vision. That just simply means let me be in that vibration. Let me remember who I am. I'm not as effed up as I thought I once was. The title of your book, which I love. Let me be that. Let me anchor in that. And really, in some ways, it can almost become really simple. Who have I come here to be? Not what have I come here to do? What if this quote unquote work could actually be much easier than I thought? It doesn't mean it's not going to be painful, but if you look at someone with an addiction, for example, or many different mental health concerns, really we're running from the experience of now. So as we move in and just gently and lovingly allow ourselves to feel, maybe the work isn't as difficult as we thought it was. I mean, I love what my friend Dr. Sue Morter says. Life is difficult and a challenge until it isn't. Right. And when I come to that moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been running my whole life. And when I just let myself look at the monster, if you will, or lean into the experience, there's a lot more lightness there than I once believed there would be. And yes, it's painful at moments, but nowhere near as painful as continuing to run from it.
And I feel like I'm living a real-time example of that with this broken foot. Like I had a lot of resistance in the beginning when this happened to the fact that it had happened. Like I was spending a lot of mental energy. Why? What happened? How did I allow this to happen?
Yes.
And then a lot of resistance to, no, I don't want to have a surgery. And like, I know I can heal this on my own. I don't need doctors to like go in there and cut me open and all these things. There's been so many steps along the way where there was resistance. And I've noticed now, like kind of 2-3 weeks into this, the more I've sort of surrendered that fighting against, this is the current time reality. Like I'm in a cast. There's nothing I can do in this moment about that. There's a surrender, I think, that has happened. My ego on some level has surrendered to this experience. And instead of focusing on what's wrong with the situation and how it's creating all these problems for me, I am now able to shift to a calmer, more receptive space where it's like, okay, what can I learn from this?
I'm laughing. I'll say I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing near you, but I had the same experience. I don't know if you remember or if you even know, Adriana, when my sort of dark night of the soul culminated with me falling off the top of a ladder and
Mhm.
crushing my heel, my
Mm.
left heel. And
My
I
one.
was like, I know exactly. I was like, let's go to dinner. I mean, I
Okay.
literally went to have sushi dinner with, just sort of hobbling. And my friend is like, dude, you need to go to the hospital. I went and it was shattered in like 12 pieces. Like it was a serious thing. And I was like, isn't that interesting that I just didn't want to even acknowledge that this was happening? And
Yeah.
so there's so much information there. And I love that what you're saying, because ultimately to surrender to that, and it's fascinating. And I'm not saying that I fell off the ladder so I could have this experience, but 6 weeks of not being able, and I lived up the hill, and you remember I used to live up a hill. And so like I was there for 6 weeks. Now, after about 3 weeks, I was figuring out ways to get out and take an Uber down, or whatever. But I spent some really solid time because of this reflecting on a lot of experiences that had happened. And those were some of the most rich experiences of my life. I had a 72-hour period where I closed my curtains, turned off my phone, and just really let myself move into the deeper experiences that had gone through. And honestly, it was the most transformative experience of my life.
Wow. Yeah. I wouldn't trade anything, like my whole 20-year thing with Lyme disease. I wouldn't trade any of that because it was through that dark night of the soul that I came out the other end. It's how I learned all the things I learned, all the healing modalities and different ways of thinking. Like I wouldn't trade any of the like negative experiences I've had because they've all contributed to my spiritual growth and evolution. And I try to remember that in present time, in this challenging time where there's a lot of fear it's survival, real survival fears people are having right now, which are totally valid and understandable. And yet when people come to me in these dark times and in the midst of the dark night of the soul they might be going through, I just invite them to remember that in the presence of light there is no darkness, and that if we can start to reconnect with that wholeness within and work through and heal some of that dark stuff, the light will begin to radiate again. So
That's
hopefully
right.
this conversation has inspired people to some degree, to remember that. Any final thoughts for the audience? And I know there's some people watching now, later. Feel free to type in comments or give us any feedback of your own experiences or anything like that. And even if you're watching this later, we'll check the comments and reply. But any final thoughts, TJ?
Yeah, Adriana, my final thoughts are almost always the same. I like to just invite people to lean into this. If no one has told you today, you are an infinite being. You came into the world as a literal spark of divinity, and that's the truth of who and what you are. And anchoring in that knowing will allow you to move into whatever needs to be healed so that you can actually embody that more. And that whatever your experience in this moment is an opportunity for greater transformation than you've ever known.
Thank you so much for that, TJ. Thank you for the gift that you are to the world, to my life. What a joy it is to have these conversations with you and these reminders, the universe, speaking to me through you. Reminders to myself, reminders to everyone, hopefully tuning in. And if people want to find out more about you, your work, where can they go?
tjwoodward.com. One stop. It's all there.
One stop. All the links are there. Thank you so much, TJ. Thanks everyone for tuning in. If you found this conversation of value, please don't hesitate to share it, comment on it, subscribe to the things that we do. This is going on YouTube. Follow us there. TJ and I both have a lot of stuff out on YouTube and all different places. We'd love to engage with you and contribute in whatever way we can. So thanks, everyone. See you next time.